All right, Bill, I think we can go ahead and get going.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Bill Brennan, Director of the Office of Economics at the Surface Transportation Board.
And my name is Ian Anderson. I am a transportation industry analyst in the Office of Economics.
We're glad you could join us today. Ian and I will be the staff presenting during this technical conference in EP 704 Sub 1, the board's review of Boxcar, Commodity, and TOFC COFC exemptions. We're joined by two colleagues, Douglas Pelsey, an economist and a key member of our team. Douglas will be running our slides this morning. Charles Vance, an attorney at the board, will be serving as our moderator and tracking your questions in the Q&A function. You can find the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Just click it and send your questions in. Let me begin with some preliminary remarks. First, while we've all spent more time participating in virtual events in 2020 than we expected or desired, we also know things don't always go as smoothly as we would like. So if we have a hiccup with the technology this morning, please bear with us. And when we change slides, we'll try to give you a second or so for everything to load properly. Second, the purpose of this technical conference is for board staff to provide a presentation of the approach described in the September 30th decision and to answer technical questions about the mechanics of that approach. Please remember that we are the board staff, not the board. Accordingly, nothing we say here should be construed to modify the board's September 30th decision or suggest the board has reached conclusions that are not indicated in the board's decisions. Our goal here is to explain the approach's mechanics so that stakeholders can provide comments to the board. In its September 30th decision, the board released visualizations for one commodity, hydraulic cement, but the Office of Economics has prepared similar charts for all the commodities on this record. And as the board indicated in that decision, these data visualizations and all of our code can be found in our work papers, which are available upon request and with appropriate confidentiality undertakings. If it will help you prepare your comments, I encourage you to request them. Those work papers also contain extensive remarks and notations which go into much greater detail than we will be able to cover in this presentation. Third, Ian and I will give an overview presentation that will incorporate answers to certain questions we received in advance of this technical conference. Please note that a number of non-technical questions were also submitted in advance and that we will not be able to address in this forum, including, for example, questions related to modeling alternatives. But I encourage you to raise those substantive and policy issues in your written comments to the board. We will also try to address additional questions that arise during today's presentation. You may type questions into the Q&A feature if something we're saying isn't clear to you, or if you have a broader question you want to pose. At the end of the conference, Charles will read those questions that we are able to address. So, why are we here today? We're here to discuss a new approach developed by the Office of Economics that seeks to shed light on the questions of exemption and revocation, questions that are still pending on this record. We will try to describe the mechanics of this new approach to you as precisely as we can to aid in your comments in this docket. As the board stated in its September 30th decision, this approach may be a potentially important new tool that could facilitate additional analysis in this docket and would benefit from public comment. It is important to note that the board has indicated it does not anticipate that this approach would necessarily provide a final conclusive answer to the questions at hand. Should the commodity exemptions at issue here be revoked? And should additional commodity exemptions be adopted? Several of the questions submitted in advance asked why we are proposing certain commodities for exemption in the indicator dashboard. Let me be clear. Inclusion of a commodity in the indicator dashboards does not mean that the commodity has been proposed or recommended for exemption or revocation. All commodities on the record in this proceeding were included in the indicator dashboards, and the only commodities that have been proposed for revocation are those listed in the board's 2016 Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. While this approach does certain things, like try to identify changes in market conditions between 1992 and 2018 and explore the potential influence of transportation alternatives, it does not seek to answer the ultimate qualitative question of whether a commodities regulation is necessary to carry out the rail transportation policy. Before we begin to talk about the approach, let's first discuss the 2016 NPRM. In that decision, the board proposed to revoke the exemptions for 5 commodities: crushed stone and riprap, coke from coal, cement, primary iron and steel products, and iron and steel scrap. The board observed that for coke and for the steel commodities, there had been a fundamental technological change in the industry as steel manufacturers moved from reliance on traditional blast furnaces located in the Great Lakes region to electric arc furnaces located in the South. The board observed similar technological changes in cement markets. Today, there are fewer but larger cement factories, implying that many cement movements travel longer distances than before. The board authorized stakeholder meetings in this proceeding in 2019. Thank you to those of you who were able to participate in those meetings. And now that gets us to more recent events and the board's decision in September 2020 to release this potential new approach for comment.
As an initial matter, the new approach is designed to increase the granularity of the commodity analysis. For example, instead of looking at cement at the 4-digit stick level, the approach considers cement at the 5-digit stick code level, where there are in fact 2 distinct commodities: hydraulic cement and ready mix cement. The overwhelming majority of this is hydraulic cement, but as we looked at the data at the 5-digit stick level, we noticed that ready mix cement often moves in intermodal containers. A similar distinction is visible in the area of crushed stone, where clear differences can be seen with respect to agricultural limestone, stick code 14211, and riprap, stick 14219. The new approach looked at 44 commodities at the 5-digit and 4 commodities at the even more refined 7-digit stick level. The new approach began with the 1992 carload waybill sample as our starting point. Some of you have asked why we made this choice. We did so to mirror the baseline used in the 2016 NPRM. We then looked at the most recent waybill year, 2018.
So let's talk about what our new approach is and what it is not. We received a number of questions about what hypotheses we're testing with our various indicators. But this new approach does not test various null hypotheses because it is not an application of predictive or inferential statistics. Rather, the principal statistical technique used here is exploratory data analysis, or EDA, the analysis of data sets and the summarization of their characteristics using visual methods. As noted by the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, NIST, the EDA approach is precisely that, an approach, not a set of techniques, but an attitude, a philosophy about how data analysis should be carried out. The approach is designed to evaluate the current state of a commodities transportation market, as well as to examine the questions of whether market conditions for the commodity might have changed over the last quarter century. The new approach accomplishes this in part by identifying geographic modal influences and evaluating the entire distribution of RVC ratios and other figures rather than just the average. And while this approach consists of a number of moving parts, at bottom, this is really quite simple. We're taking movements from the 1992 and 2018 waybill sample and then placing those observations into buckets, for lack of a better word. We use data visualization techniques to compare buckets, hoping to glean deeper insights into the data. Finally, some of those insights are gathered into the indicator dashboard for summarization and ease of use. Again, the intended goal of this technical conference is to describe in plain language how we approach this exploratory data analysis. What are the buckets? How do our algorithms work to sort movements in those buckets and generate slides like this one? All the coding and algorithms we relied upon are available from the board as part of our work papers.
Let's talk about the data we used and the tools we employed. Then we'll present a broad brush treatment of what we did before getting into the specifics. The data we use for the new approach come from several sources. Information necessary to evaluate potential water carrier influences are drawn from the port facilities data of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Institute for Water Resources. We employed the Basin Watersheds dataset from the U.S. Geological Survey's North American Atlas. Links to these data sources are provided in our work papers. We relied on Rail Inc.'s centralized station master and MARC register to assess potential rail carrier influences. To account for inflation, we applied the Bureau of Economic Analysis Gross Domestic Product Implicit Price Deflator. Finally, we also used the 1992 and 2018 confidential carload waybill samples. We used 4 tools to conduct this analysis: SQL, Python, ArcGIS, and Excel. In general, we used Microsoft SQL Server 2014 to store data and perform certain calculations. SQL queries were used to create, read, update, and delete data. For this analysis, SQL is used to format data, restructure it, and move it between stages of the process. Python 3 is a high-level interpreted programming language which we used to render exploratory data visualizations. ArcGIS Pro 2.5 at the advanced license tier was used to conduct our geospatial analysis, and we used Python tools within that environment as well. Excel, of course, is the standard spreadsheet program, and we used it to create our dashboards. SQL and ArcGIS need to be able to talk to each other, and to accomplish this, we configured a connection between these two environments, which allows ArcGIS to read and write to the SQL Server using Python 3.
The data's journey in our new approach can be described in 3 parts. First, various data components of the approach are prepared and transformed into more useful formats. These include database connections, GIS formats, and indexing of costs and revenues to 2018 price levels, to name a few. Second, the waybill data is run through a GIS analysis to assess potential competitive influences. Third, the outputs of the GIS analysis are consolidated and fed into the data visualization and indicator dashboard tools. It might be easier to explain all of this by working through how data is placed into the buckets, and we will start by discussing how we assign movements with respect to potential water influence. To place observed rail movements into the potential water influence buckets, we identified the latitude and longitude of ports and assigned each port to its appropriate waterway system. We then identified latitude and longitude for each freight station. Once this geospatial information was readied, we compared the freight station location of every movement in both the 1992 and 2018 waybills against the port data. If a movement in the waybill sample was found to have a port facility within 30 miles of its location at both its origin and destination, and if these ports were on the same waterway system, then we assigned that movement to the potential water influence bucket. If not, we assigned it to the does not have potential water influence bucket.
So how did we do this? The U.S. Geological Survey's North American watershed data was used to assign each port to a larger navigable waterway system. The watershed dataset connects each individual watershed to its respective waterway system. For example, the Atlantic Intracoastal System or the Mississippi River System, which happens to include the Ohio, the Missouri, the Arkansas, and several other rivers. We used this data to tie upstream facilities with their downstream counterparts, effectively creating a two-way network where movements can transit both upstream and downstream. We used this network to explore the influence of potential intermodal competition. As a simplifying mechanism, we assumed that movements are constrained to a single waterway system. Once the port data was loaded into ArcGIS, we used it to establish a reasonable starting point for the ensuing analysis. We isolated port facilities in the contiguous United States and then eliminated pleasure craft facilities, marinas, and the like. The remaining port facilities then were assigned to appropriate waterway systems. We made this assignment using ArcGIS, and the results of this preliminary analysis were fed back into SQL for later classification and use with the board's waybill traffic data. The next step in our process was to load the 1992 and 2018 confidential carload waybill samples into SQL. Technically, we loaded these as fixed width text files into SQL and then parsed them into the fields defined in the 2018 Waybill Reference Guide. We then assigned these parsed fields an appropriate data type and field name consistent with the intent of the reference guide. We applied the GDP implicit price deflator to the 1992 Waybill data to bring the expanded total variable cost and the expanded total unmasked revenue fields to their 2018 levels. While the new approach does not use all of the Waybill data fields, all of them were loaded into SQL so that parties can examine and use these data fields should they so desire. We used a looped insertion of the parsed data into the final Waybill table schema, which enabled easy incorporation of the two different Waybill years into a master table. Again, all of this is explained in greater detail in the notations included in our work papers.
Next, we assigned latitude and longitude coordinates to the origin and destination points of all movements in our 1992 and 2018 Waybill samples. There was some housekeeping we needed to do. For example, the 1992 Waybill sample includes the Soo line, but by 2018, the Soo line had been replaced in the sample by Canadian Pacific. So those two railroads needed to be linked together in the data. Additional housekeeping steps taken to prepare the data are explained in detail in our work papers. It's important to recognize that the Waybill sample itself does not contain geospatial information, but the centralized station master, or CSM, does. So whenever we found a specific station defined as a combination of a railroad numeric and freight station accounting code, or FSAC, we used the latitude and longitude assigned by the CSM to that station. In some cases, particularly in the 1992 Waybill sample, we could not find the origin or destination stations listed in the CSM, and so could not find the latitude and longitude coordinates associated with those stations. Now, this might occur if the line had been abandoned, the freight station in question had been closed, or the railroad had been shut or sold. When that is the case, when we cannot find the latitude longitude coordinates using the railroad numeric and FSAC, we infer the geospatial coordinates by looking for plausible alternatives on the same railroad, now using the railroad alpha, the same location name, and the same location state. So for example, CPUS, La Crosse, Wisconsin. If we find a match, or more than one, we stop. We choose one of these plausible locations and assign its latitude and longitude to the Waybill movement. But if that fails, we widen our search to any carrier that serves La Crosse, Wisconsin. And finally, if these steps fail, we rely upon the standard point location codes associated with the origin and destination reported in the Waybill. Multiple stations can exist for a given standard point location code, and the approach selects one of these for the purpose of determining latitude and longitude.
At this point in the analysis, geospatial coordinates have been assigned to every port and to every freight station, and we then need to examine whether the ports could potentially influence rail movements. A movement is assigned into the water influence bucket if the origin and destination of a rail movement were both within 30 miles of a port on the same waterway. We next identified each unique OD station pair in the 1992 and 2018 Waybill samples. For each pair, we calculated its proximity to nearby ports using the Python functionality in ArcGIS. If an OD station pair met our proximity and waterway network criteria, then all Waybill records moving in that lane are placed into the potential water influence bucket.
We received several questions wondering how this approach might relate to market dominance considerations. I think it is important to note that the GMIM model is designed to examine the exemption and revocation issues raised in this proceeding. The purpose of this analysis is simply to place movements into specific buckets and explore relationships between the buckets in the aggregate.
While the process used to ascribe potential railroad influence is similar to the water influence model, it also leverages additional data found in the waybill sample. We start by looking to see if there are alternative railroad stations close to both the origin and destination stations. Then we add two constraints. First, is there evidence that the same commodity moved over this alternative routing in the same year? And second, can we ensure the original railroad or railroads are not included in that alternative? If these criteria are met, the movement is placed into the potential rail influence bucket.
To do this, we separated the waybill stations into two categories, one for each waybill year, and then we considered the commodities handled. Our resulting table summarizes the waybill data characteristics by year, origin, destination, rail carriers, and commodity. Each resulting commodity waybill lane was put through the rail alternatives portion of the GMIM. Within each category, the ArcGIS analysis identifies all rail freight stations that are located within 30 miles of their origin. This analysis is repeated for every rail freight station in the 1992 sample, and again, for every freight station in the 2018 sample. Looking at these years separately enables us to explore the changes in rail transportation influences available for a given commodity. For each origin freight station, we obtained a matrix of all possible railroad station alternatives. The number of rows in the matrix for a given railroad freight station depends on the number of alternative freight stations within a 30-mile radius. We construct similar matrices for every single destination freight station. Once these matrices at origin and destination are identified, we assess whether there are any movements in the waybill sample from an alternative origin to an alternative destination station carrying the same commodity. There is one nuance. The alternative lanes must involve railroads that are different from those railroads involved in the original OD pair. The point here is that the approach does not consider a railroad as an influence on itself. If a commodity lane meets the proximity and railway network criteria, then all waybill records moving in that lane are placed into the potential rail influence bucket. If a movement has either rail or water influence attributes or both, then it's placed into the combined potential rail or water influence bucket.
A waybill's placement into the remaining buckets is relatively straightforward and uses data provided in the waybill sample. RVC ratios are calculated using expanded revenue and variable cost figures, and records with an RVC below 180% are placed into the has an RVC ratio below 180 bucket. Likewise, we use mileages reported in the waybill sample to identify movements hauled less than 500 miles. These moves are placed in the shorter haul bucket. At this point in the process, every waybill record in the 1992 waybill data and every waybill record in the 2018 waybill data have been placed in the following buckets: has or does not have water influence, has or does not have rail influence, has or does not have rail and or water influence, is or is not below RVC ratio 180, does or does not have a length of haul less than 500 miles.
The board's approach places each waybill into the applicable buckets, and then for a given commodity looks for changes over time. We use two data visualization techniques to do this, both of which provide a visual representation of the changes in a given commodity's transportation marketplace. The first technique is a pair plot, or more technically, the bivariate distribution matrix. This is the pair plot for hydraulic cement. So what does it show? Well, it shows that there has been an increase in the length of haul. There are more movements moving at 500 miles and beyond. There's been a substantial increase in tons per car. There's been an increase in revenues per car, no doubt related to the fact that both mileages and tonnages have gone up. There's been an increase in RVC distribution, as revenues seem to have increased faster than the variable costs. In the scatter plot, we can see further that the further that the railroad rolls a car, the more revenue it tends to collect.
The second technique is the violin plot, which is used to show the carload probability distribution of RVC, RPC, and haul lengths, which are segmented into different combinations of the buckets we mentioned earlier. Violin plots rely on kernel density estimation, or KDE, to explore relationships in the data between waybills in various buckets. Violin plots are a technique commonly used in exploratory data analysis to give a visual representation of a particular distribution. So you see here the violin plot for hydraulic cement, all records for each waybill year. What does it show us? In this violin plot, we can see again that RVC ratios are rising based on the shift in probability densities. And also, we can see that traffic volumes are growing based on the size of the 2018 violin plot, the green one on the right. The hash marks in the margins show the system RVC quartiles for all carload traffic. The identification of the 25th, 50th, and 75th quartiles is a standard technique in exploratory data analysis. Their presence within the violin plots here and in the reference marks outside the violin plots is meant as a visual aid, though some of that information is picked up in the indicator dashboards as well. By placing these points both inside and outside the violin plots, it is easier to determine how a particular commodity's RVC ratio is behaving relative to the figure for all carload traffic. So, for hydraulic cement, we can see that the increase in RVC ratios is outpacing the increase for carload traffic generally. Next, let's look at the violin plot for hydraulic cement again, but this time we're segmented on haul length. So this violin plot juxtaposes the probability densities for longer haul and shorter haul movements, giving us a more granular insight into RVC ratios depending on the haul length bucket. We can see that RVC ratios for shorter haul moves are generally distributed higher than RVC ratios for longer haul moves. We can also see there has been an increase in the number of carloads moving more than 500 miles. And for both shorter haul and longer haul traffic, there has been an increase in RVC ratios.
We're now looking at the violin plot that examines rail or water influence, this time with and without that influence. What we can see here is that where an alternative influence exists, RVC ratios tend to be lower. So these are the examples of the sorts of violin plots we've created, and for each commodity, we created 37 data visualizations consisting of the one pair plot and 3 sets of 12 violin plots.
So these data visualizations are iteratively produced by a Python script, which is stored in the open source Jupyter Notebook format. The script employs several widely used open source Python data analytics libraries, including Pandas, a tabular data manipulation library, Matplotlib, which is a library underlying plot creation, Seaborn, another plotting library, and NumPy, a high-performance data manipulation and statistical exploration library. One common element to both types of visualizations is the kernel density estimates that show probability distributions. To render these curves, we used the Seaborn plotting library. For each bucket, our process removes outliers outside 3 standard deviations of the mean. The plots for the remaining data are constructed according to Seaborn's KDE implementation, which we describe here at a high level. Each data point is plotted on a number line representing RVC, RPC, haul length, or tons per car. And then for each data point, a kernel curve is drawn. And then the sum of the area beneath each kernel curve is taken, and the resulting area is plotted. So that's the gray area, the gray curve on your screen now. For the pair plots, each data point is a waybill observation. In the violin plots, each data point is an expanded carload to control for changes in billing practices affecting the number of carloads on a given waybill. We also made some other coding choices that control Seaborn's handling of the data. For the purposes of our exploratory data analysis, we set the KDE bandwidth at 0.15. The bandwidth parameter controls the height of each kernel curve. The larger the bandwidth parameter, the smoother the curve. Setting the bandwidth at 0.15 permitted us to see distinct clusters of traffic more readily. We also established a cut parameter, which truncates the KDE curve at the limit of the filtered observed data. This gives us a better sense of the observed bounds of the data set. In some cases, we also augmented the violin plots by including reference points for the overall carload traffic group. These data are portrayed in the margins of the violin plots. We calculated the system-wide 25th percentile, median, and 75th percentile figures and inserted hash marks onto the plot for each of these system-wide figures. This is a particularly busy slide, so we'll pause here for a second to let you read and consider it.
We brought some of the insights from our exploratory data analysis into the dashboards for summarization. The dashboards were described in great detail in the board's September 30th decision, and we will not repeat everything that was said there. But to recap, the dashboard consists of two initial screens, 8 indicators, and an overall dashboard signal. The initial screens are intended to identify commodities having a particularly weak evidentiary basis for revocation or a particularly strong evidentiary basis for exemption. The first such screen examines the amount of traffic moving at rates above the jurisdictional threshold. The threshold for this screen has been set at 5% as a reasonable approximation of the point at which there would be so little RVC greater than 180 traffic that regulation of that commodity might be unnecessary.
The second screen examines the percentage of traffic that moves in intermodal service, which we determined using AAR equipment types P, Q, and S, which are platform, well, and stack cars, and also the presence of a trailer or container unit. The initial designation for this screen has been set at 40% as a reasonable approximation of the point at which there is enough intermodal traffic to indicate that shippers of that commodity can readily avail themselves of other transportation alternatives, and that regulation of that commodity might similarly be unnecessary. In the revocation context, if either or both of these initial screens triggers the threshold criteria, the commodity is assigned a weak overall dashboard signal, and the other individual indicator data are not considered in the dashboard.
With respect to the 8 individual dashboard indicators, we can answer one question that was submitted in advance of the technical conference. When comparing a particular commodity's RVC or RPC against all carload traffic, did board staff remove that commodity from the all carload comparison group? The answer is no. The comparison is to all carload traffic, not all other carload traffic. As described in the September 30th decision, each strong, moderate, and weak indicator signal generates a score of 2, 1, or 0, respectively. Except where one of the initial screens is tripped, the overall dashboard signal is generated by combining the signals from the individual indicators and taking the mean of the 8 indicator scores. A mean of 1.33 or greater is labeled strong. A mean of 0.67 or less is weak, and everything in between is moderate. We again point out that the overall dashboard signal does not by itself suggest that any particular recommendation and is not intended as a mechanical rule used to dictate decisions about revocation or exemption for particular commodities. Rather, the strong, moderate, and weak overall dashboard signals are merely suggestive of whether market conditions may have changed in the last quarter century. There are, of course, additional qualitative factors for the board to consider as it approaches any revocation or exemption decision. The data visualizations and the indicator dashboards were developed as a potential additional set of tools for the board's possible use in considering these larger questions. As explained in the September 30th decision, there are 4 versions of the indicator dashboard. 2 are used for commodities to consider for exemption, for the exemption revocation, 1 relying on RVC ratios and the other relying on revenue per carload. And there are 2 dashboards for commodities to consider for exemption. Also, again, 1 on RVC, the other on revenue per carload. It's important to note that there is one difference between the revocation and exemption dashboards. The logic of the exemption dashboards is the same for the revocation dashboards, but the assignment of labels and scores is reversed. So that's to say, an indicator that would generate a strong signal in the revocation dashboard will generate a weak signal in the exemption dashboard and vice versa. Now that concludes our prepared remarks this morning. I would now like to ask our moderator to read questions that we have received during the presentation and that we can address today. As I indicated earlier, there may be questions that were submitted today that are more appropriately addressed in written comments to the board. So if your question is not read by the moderator, that is the reason. But the board still wants to hear your views through the comment process.
Thank you, Bill. First, a recording of the technical conference, which includes the slide presentation, will be posted under the Meetings and Hearings tab on the board's website. The board will also look into adding the slide presentation as a standalone entry to the document. Second, there were a number of questions submitted through Zoom's Q&A function during the technical conference that asked whether the board would be willing to consider certain changes to the approach. As indicated earlier, those issues are more appropriately addressed in the written comments to the board, and we look forward to receiving those comments. That's it, Bill.
Thanks, Charles. Well, that concludes today's technical conference. Thank you very much for your participation. Consistent with the board's November 25th decision setting this technical conference, comments are due to the board on the new approach by January 22nd and replies on February 22nd. Again, thank you and goodbye.